Welcome to the Wahoo White House. You're listening to aspiring political analyst and student here at the university, John Downey. Our guests on the show today include Corey Runkel and Jack Polk, two other students at the university. Corey hails from Fairfax, Virginia, and classifies himself as a pretty liberal person. Jack, from St. Louis, Missouri, prefers conservatism. Our discussion today concerns a very controversial topic, identity politics and how it relates to political correctness. The interest in this topic was sparked by our followers, especially after the political discussion that occurred with former student Nicholas Del Rosso. Our hope is to start from a national perspective and work down to the UVA community. So let's jump right in. The definition of identity politics is the political frame of mind whereby people view themselves first as members of ethnic, religious, or gender groups before more broad-based, idea-driven political parties. How does this definition create problems or solutions for the current system of governance in America?
So I think, first, give some examples of what identity politics is. The more positive groups is Black Lives Matter, as well as women's suffrage in the early 20th century. I mean, these are based off of we need equality for these certain groups. But I mean, obviously, I think all these people will agree that equality is important across the board, but the focus is on them. And in the recent election, do you want to talk about how Hillary used identity politics?
Yeah, so that's what happens with identity politics is while it is really important to establish equality for everyone and make sure that everyone is being treated respectfully and all, the issue is that sometimes it gets overemphasized to the point where it becomes exclusive and more divisive. So what happens is when you're Hillary Clinton, who identity politics became a real weapon of hers, what she didn't realize in this election is, as Mark Lilla says in the New York Times, she started pandering towards minority groups in order to gain their vote, in order to come out as the politically correct side. And I know we're going to get to political correctness later, but what that does is that excludes people like white middle-class males who, while they're supposedly, the majority and have benefits, and it is easier to be a white person in the United States, and I think it's important to recognize that, but they become excluded and they think that Hillary Clinton's not worrying about their issues, and they think that, and they are having issues in some parts of the country, especially in the Rust Belt, where they're losing their jobs very quickly and healthcare is very poor and things like that. When you're playing the game of identity politics, the important issues get lost, such as, healthcare, economy, employment, things like that, in the name of promoting something that, especially if you're living in an isolated community, if you're living among other white cisgender people, right, you're not going to be too worried about.
Yeah, and I think I definitely would say equality for everyone is a huge issue, and I'm not saying that there are definitely larger issues with minority groups. I think that's true. However, in a democracy, if you don't cater to other people, they're not going to vote for you. I mean, just the mechanics of how politics works in the U.S. and it a lot of it separates and it creates little factions that are harder to unify and organize.
Right, and I actually have a question about that in a bit, but first, Jack, you kind of touched on this. Is political correctness related to identity politics, or do you think they're separated? If so, how do they relate and how closely?
Yeah, I think they are related. I think that they're related very closely, actually. I think that political correctness is essentially the carrying out of identity politics. Identity politics is more of a mindset. It's more of a intangible social understanding. And I think that political correctness is behaving in society with that understanding.
Okay. And I think I would also, I would disagree a little bit in where I think the root of it is more in political correctness and less in identity politics. Really? But they're definitely they feed off one another. That's clear. But I think what happens is when you separate people into smaller groups, it builds barriers where there didn't used to be barriers, and that is a harmful force in politics.
Although there's not a definite answer here, but on your opinion, both, I'll start with Corey and then we'll go to Jack. Do you think identity politics works? Do you think that the subdivision, do you think it gives minorities a voice, or do you think it creates a chaotic noise in an attempt to reach solutions in our government? First, Corey.
So I think there's too much out there right now. I think there's definitely value in having groups that are only focused on certain rights. It's hard to say who can and should be in those groups, but I think it's too dominant right now. And I think an example of that is Trump's election was you had a lot of small hodgepodge groups that tried to come together under Hillary and kind of failed because they just didn't agree on as much.
Right.
And I think, honestly, I'm unsure of how valid this is, but like, you could definitely make the argument that like Trump's election was a form of him playing to white identity politics. They just happen to be the largest group. Yeah, I mean, it was what you do when you play identity politics is the largest group wins every time on that one.
To add on to that, identity politics is always going to be a divisive issue, and that's why I think this election was so divisive. Is because there was so much about identity politics, and I think that's another issue about why it's being overemphasized. Is people all of a sudden, start focusing more on their white identity or their minority identity. What happens is people disagree, and all of a sudden people get so caught up in this argument that they forget about who's talking more about who's going to build a stronger economy and who's going to be more level-headed when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah.
I think identity played way too large of a role in this election. I think that now we're back in the real world and Trump is president, and a lot of people are complaining about issues that they didn't think would be issues when they're so focused on identity. And now we
Talk
don't.
about identity politics and how it relates to white people, which you did mention. You said white identity. There exist articles such as one I read recently in the New York Times that white is not in its own identity, that it's an evasion from race, perhaps because it's currently the majority in America. How should white be handled in comparison to much smaller and more specific identities, and should it be considered its own identity?
That's a very difficult question because it is true that white people have essentially dominated in this continent since their arrival and have done very bad things to minorities and are responsible for setting up systems that create inequality that persists at least their effects persist to this day.
Okay.
But on the other hand, white people still should have a hand in this argument.
Yeah.
White people are still citizens of the United States and should be able to comment on whatever issue is around. So it's really hard to find that balance between accounting for people who have been disabled quite literally by white groups trying to maintain their power in the past versus making sure that everyone has an equal say today considering what has gone on in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and I think it highlights a fundamental flaw in identity politics, which is saying that because white is such a big large amount of people here, it's much easier to see the differences in its own identity. I mean, if you just focus on racial identity, you miss a lot more of what a person is. But I think what is important is that you can't just pigeonhole people into when you claim identity politics and you claim yourself as just that identity, then you kind of allow people to take the conception of that identity and use it to assume things about who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just try and shoehorn people into labels, which I think is bad. Is bad in most ways.
I think it makes society more legible, more easy to understand.
Because at some point you have to something you have to use descriptive terms.
It does, and I think legibility is this concept. Governments would create roads in order to better understand how to get from point A to point B, but if you live within a certain region, you might not take those roads. So that's kind of an analogy for the way identity politics works, where we create these kind of broad terms to try and understand groups and make them more legible, but that's not really going to capture everyone. That's going to create blanket statements that are going to cause some people to evade labels and be misunderstood, and that's going to also generate a lot of negative labels along with positive labels for every group.
So I guess lastly, we've been looking at the macro, the global version of this. Let's take it down to a micro level. So here at UVA, do you guys think that identity politics, do you think they help or hurt the community? What are your thoughts on that?
So in some sense, I'm more open to it simply because there's less power, there's less real effects. But at the same time, though, I think it does definitely socially just segregate people in terms of who they interact with. And so I think the political groups on grounds, including those that are really focused on identities, are important and useful because a lot of people learn here, they take out in the real world, and a lot of them are very academically organized. But I would say that maybe we should do somewhat less of an emphasis on it.
Yeah, I think right now it's overemphasized and we're too immature to really understand the best way to look at this going forward. We don't have enough understanding of other people's identities and our own identities and what identities really say about society. And I think right now that we're applying our immature understanding to how things are being carried out day by day at UVA, and you see that in examples like the recent student elections where a stereotypical sorority girl who evidently grew up privileged, her image and her ability to lead is judged more on her identity than her actual qualities that determine how good of a leader she would be. And I'm not saying that she should or should not have won the election. What I'm saying is I really don't know because we didn't hear that much about her actual policy. It's her identity, and it's also who she supported for United States president. You know, he's Donald Trump. She supported Trump, and he's considered an enemy of political correctness. And just because of that, her support of Trump makes her unqualified, and we don't know why she supported Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So I think that exemplifies for a number of reasons why identity politics is being taken too far, and why it's probably not healthy for our community to focus too much on identity politics. And obviously we need to treat each other with respect. You know, there have been racist incidents recently that we need to take a look at, but that can be addressed without identity politics. You can just say, let's be good to each other and let's not point out our differences. Let's celebrate our commonalities and celebrate.
Just not be as hateful. I mean, that's
and that could be done. We don't need identity politics. We don't need political correctness to do that.
And I think the election's a good example of like how it's really been taking a nasty turn, because voting for Trump does not disqualify you from being like the student council president. I mean, I think she was unqualified because she hadn't been in student council, but like that, people would definitely I think more personally rallied behind the idea that she voted Trump and her dad is like a wealthy Virginia politician, and so things were seen as handed to her, when in reality evidently they weren't given up. Well, evidently they weren't in this election, given how much people reacted to her. I mean, people's perception is a lot of is how that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the letter from concerned students, it talks a little bit about her lack of experience and way more about her support for Trump and way more about using money to get votes. And then the Cavalier Daily prints this pretty offensive picture of her, with her sorority letters and sitting on just stacks of money. It kind of demonstrates how identity politics can create this division, this ugliness, by focusing more on our differences and trying to capitalize on that than focusing on what we gain from each other in our common
values. I think especially with student council, something rather small like that, is they focused a lot on not policies that people had, although I will admit that Sarah Kenny's were quite a bit more substantial than Kelsey Kilgore's, but the Cavalier Daily article focused purely on their identity, and it twisted it, because Sarah Kenny also, I think she's in AFI.
She's also in a sorority, an ISC sorority.
Yeah, and her identity compared to Kelsey's is pretty similar.
Yeah.
It's interesting that but identity politics was used to draw them apart in ways that I wouldn't I would have drawn them apart purely by experience and by their policies.
Right. I believe that's all the questions I have for you guys today. Thank you, Corey and Jack, for your enlightening commentary. We hope our listeners take into consideration this conversation in the pursuit of the most effective way to understand identity politics. We also hope that we've helped some of our listeners better deal with the current situation regarding PC culture here at UVA.